The longer paper that this draws on my comments today sketches out a theory of interdisciplinarity. And it's a theory that's based on Pierre Bourdieu's work in field theory, and it's grounded historically in archival work and interviews with various social scientists in several countries. My approach to the interdisciplinarity differs from some existing accounts, I think, in three main ways. First, some of the accounts start from one discipline and move outward from that. If you read about the history of historical sociology, usually it's a story of sociology as it's engaged with history or historicity. I examine instead the full range of interactions among disciplines, so the history-sociology axis becomes bidirectional. I look at it from both directions. Secondly, rather than viewing disciplines as unified totalities or homogeneous waves in a metaphor that's been applied frequently, I analyze disciplines as social fields, that is, as dynamic, relational, internally heterogeneous, conflictual assemblages. Rather than asking how an entire discipline interacts with another discipline, I focus on the ways particular actors or groups within a discipline relate to specific actors and ideas in other disciplines. I ask how different kinds of interdisciplinary practices are supported or hindered by forces located both inside of disciplines and at varying extremes from the discipline. And in particular, I'm interested in the ways these are driven by scientific problems that are generated within the discipline, field-specific interests and battles, as well as outside pressures and cajoling and so on. Interdisciplinarity, I argue, is motivated by three main kinds of interest. And the most important kinds of interests are goals that are pursued within a specific field for symbolic or material gain or for their own sake. So interest is defined here broadly, not in a narrow economic sense. Other interests derive from conformity with external authorities, from irreducibly scientific questions that push people to look beyond their home field. Scholars located in different sectors of a given field have differing interests relating to interdisciplinarity then. Third, my account rejects any assumption that interdisciplinarity is an inherent good. Instead, I ask which forms of interdisciplinarity have been conducive to social scientific innovation, to discovery, to creativity, and vice versa. The more generative configurations involve interactions between actors and positions with relatively equal power in two different disciplines, I find. Such interactions tend to be motivated by intellectual problems and field-specific conflicts rather than by external compulsion or incitement. These conjunctures result from serendipitous resonances and encounters that lead disciplines to interpenetrate dialectically over time in a processual way. Things are not as generative, I find, where interdisciplinarity is externally induced, where it's one-sided, coming from one of the disciplines only, or where it's organized around a division of labor rather than a fusion of perspectives. Disciplinary autonomy is therefore, paradoxically, a precondition for the more fruitful kinds of interdisciplinarity. Several questions guide this research. First, what are the main forms of interdisciplinary contact, avoidance, and exchange? Which ones are best suited to nurturing creativity and innovation? What are the underlying sources of more symmetrical kinds of interactions? What accounts for interdisciplinary desire in and of itself? Why are different sectors of a discipline associated with different styles, strategies, and targets in their forays outward? Some forms of interaction seem to be more symmetrical, others are asymmetrical. Some are processual and dialectical and dialogic, others are oriented toward discrete outputs. So those are the kind of differences I'm looking at. Let me very briefly discuss the ways in which I think Bourdieu's field theory illuminates this problem of the formation and the erosion of disciplinary boundaries and patterns of repulsion and interaction among different disciplines. A scientific field for Pierre Bourdieu is a social microcosm endowed with its own laws of functioning, and one which is partially autonomous from the necessities of the larger social macrocosm that encompasses it. Fields are governed by competition for a particular symbolic resource over an extended period of time. Fields can undergo specific revolutions, to use Bourdieu's term, which redefine the resources around which conflict is organized or their valuation, and fields may be killed off, they can disappear, they can be swallowed up by other fields. They're not static, in other words. Most fields are defined by two principal axes. One axis indexes the particular resource around which competition is organized, and the other runs from heteronomy to autonomy, and this axis is crucial when you're considering scientific disciplines because differences in independence from the outside world are linked to differing postures toward interdisciplinarity. Scientific heteronomy is a situation in which practices are oriented mainly toward actors and ideas located outside the main home field. When members of a discipline can't resist the pull of an adjacent discipline or the field of power, for example, in the case we've just heard about, the field of the Defense Department, interdisciplinarity tends to take a more impoverished and one-sided form. Indeed, the style of interdisciplinary rapprochement varies depending on position within the home discipline. Heteronymous positions are pulled into the ambit of external agencies. More autonomous positions tend, although of course not in all cases, to seek contexts relevant to their scientific interests or useful in struggles inside the home field. The notion of subfield is crucial to this discussion. All of the scientific subfield's participants also participate in the environing discipline. They pass through the same gatekeeping mechanisms, they have the same credentialing controls. At the same time, a subfield is capable of becoming distinct enough to invert or reverse the values that are placed on certain epistemological and ontological and theoretical and methodological claims in the discipline of which they are a part. They sometimes generate their own habitus, their own forms of what Bourdieu calls scientific libido, their own forms of symbolic capital, and struggles over subfield-specific stakes. A subfield can revise or invert the values, and a great example of this is given by our colleague Liz Wingrove in her study of American political science, where she looks at the subfield of political theory and the way that it systematically inverts the values placed on normativity, regularity determinism, and other things within the hierarchy of empirical versus theoretical work in political science as a whole. A subfield can revise and invert those values. And interdisciplinary forays are often actually from within these subfields. That's why it's important, I think, to analyze these. Disciplinary fields are also grouped into larger metafields, meta-groupings of disciplines. The assignment of disciplines to metafields varies historically and cross-nationally, and this too promotes specific lines of interdisciplinarity and discourages others. An example of this is the historicism of most German social science before 1933. This was encouraged by the shared location of sociologists, economists, anthropologists, and historians within the German University division of the Geisteswissenschaften, or the human sciences, which was juxtaposed to the natural sciences. In France, Durkheimian sociologies, to take another example, its aversion to the topic of the state and politics, often remarked upon, resulted partly from the fact that sociology was grouped in the French university into the letters faculty, together with philosophy, history, and geography and ethnology, while political science was only taught at Sciences Po, the famous political science university, whose main mission at the time was training national elites for the French administration. So there was no real theorizing of the political going on anywhere in the French university. We also need to consider the broader context surrounding the scientific field. And here, of course, this is the contextual milieu that most work in this area has often focused on: states, corporations, broader social processes like capitalism, crisis, revolution, and so on. A final set of consideration in field theory, to close off this part of the paper, concerns the spatial unit of analysis. Fields are spatially specific. They exist at scales larger and smaller than the nation state. Despite the fact that many of Pierre Bourdieu's own studies are on the nation state scale, this is by no means true of the other work done by his students or other people working with his theory. Most social scientific fields continue, as Johann Heilbronn has shown empirically, to have very strong national accents. Disciplines differ in their orientation, he also has shown, toward international scholarship. International orientations are used to fight domestic battles often in domestic fields. Scholars finally move through international spaces due to migration, exile, and other things, and this can lead to devaluation as well as inflation of their scientific capital. Now I'll turn to the main part of the paper briefly. In the bulk of the paper, I explore interactions between history and sociology in Germany and France since the late 19th century. Rather than asking then about the rise of historical sociology or the rise of social history, I examined the full range of interactions between the two disciplines. This pairing of the two is well suited for this because the relative power of the two disciplines hasn't been constant. It's varied over time, even though history is, of course, much older. I find first that the most widely touted episodes of interdisciplinarity have been one-sided or unidirectional ones. American historical sociology, despite some prominent exceptions like Charles Tilly, has operated without much contact with actual historians most of the time. Well, West German social history, or the so-called Historische Sozialwissenschaft of the Bielefeld School, had little contact, it turns out, with West German sociologists after the 1960s, other than Habermas. Historicist sociologists during the Weimar Republic, similarly, interestingly, opened themselves up to being interpenetrated by historicism and became utterly historicist, many of them, the majority of them at least, and that was an epistemological stance generated within the history discipline, but they did it without much coming back from the side, much reciprocal interest from actual historians. One particular instance of a more symmetrical form of interdisciplinarity that I explore in the paper, but I can't go into detail here, actually occurred during the Nazi period, and this was so-called ethnic history. Here, historians entered into an ongoing relationship with some right-wing sociologists in some truly odious policy-oriented work. But what's interesting about the formal aspects of this collaboration, especially at the University of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in the Far East, is that it actually generated a kind of a fusion of perspectives and a dialectical organization of their thinking. And this actually continued through the war into the 1950s and 60s in venues like the West German government's funded Working Group for Modern Social History, which gave rise to German social history at the University of Bielefeld and elsewhere. So German social history grew directly out of these Nazi-era collaborations between sociologists and historians. The two most promising examples of dialogic and processual forms of interdisciplinarity, though, are French ones. The first involves sociologists and the interwar journal Annales, the famous history journal. The second involves a group of historians and sociologists around Pierre Bourdieu and his students since the 1980s. Both of these rapprochements occurred during crises of professional recruitment and succession in the two disciplines, in the interwar period and in the 1980s. During both periods, the subgroups that approached one another were drawn from the autonomous, heterodox, and research-oriented sectors of their respective disciplines. Conditions for sustained interaction between the disciplines became stronger after World War I in France because of the reduced power of the Durkheimian camp, since many of them died, including Durkheim himself, and the fact that the leading Durkheimians now articulated a more tolerant stance toward historians than they had before the war. A new generation of historians also entered the profession at this moment of the interwar period at a moment of severe professional crisis, no jobs for historians. This solidified their structural affinities for sociologists, most of whom were also on thin ice institutionally between the wars. The intellectual complementarities between the neo-Durkheimians, or the students of Durkheim, and the Annales historians were as important as these structural homologies between the two groups, or these resonances. Sociology promised to help the Annales historians think about problems of generalization, comparison, collective consciousness, and causality. The Annales historian Marc Bloch helped sociologist Maurice Albvachs think through his conception of collective memory, and both of them published on collective memory at the same time. Sociologist Célestin Bouglet, who was a major Durkheimian, overcame the traditional resistance by Durkheim to analyzing the unique event by working through the ideas actually of German neo-historicist philosophy of history. And Raymond Aron finally became an advocate of what he called historical sociology between the wars. I won't talk about the post-war period since I don't have enough time, but it's interesting that the much-touted interdisciplinarity of the École Pratique des Hautes Études, and particularly Brodel's interdisciplinarity, actually doesn't track on the ground to any real existing interdisciplinarity. There's very little actual mutual fusion of ideas at this time, and this has been proven by Lutz Raphael's magisterial book on the Annales School. How can we explain the disappearance of the sociology history axis in the 50s and the 60s, I asked? It's partially because Brodel had risen to hegemonic power within the École, the sociologists were divided, the new kinds of sociologists, some of them were interested in philosophy, history was sort of averse to philosophy, especially existentialism and structuralism in the 1960s. I can't go into much detail about that. I then move on to the Bourdieu moment. The Bourdieu moment is interesting because Bourdieu initially has very little contact with history, but in the 1980s, historians are entering an epistemological crisis. The old Annales school approach has collapsed, and they're looking for something new. And as you may know, if you follow the Annales School, now the word social sciences is included in the subtitle of the journal. That's a relatively recent thing. Now, I don't want to attribute that entirely to Pierre Bourdieu's influence, but there's a number of leading French historians, Roger Chartier and others, who've expressed their great debt to Pierre Bourdieu. So in conclusion, it's a commonplace that scientific discoveries emerge at the frontiers between disciplines, and that the rigid embrace of a single discipline can stunt the scholarly imagination. The most successful instances of interdisciplinarity result from overdetermined resonances and synchronicities. It's unlikely that any good forms of interdisciplinarity can be induced top-down by administrations. The most productive forms involve forays into adjacent disciplines motivated by intellectual, scientific, and strategic interests that are generated within a given discipline. A historical field analysis points to the necessary, if not sufficient, conditions for this kind of productive interdisciplinarity, and so on. And this leads me to conclude then with a muted defense of disciplines. This is not a full-fledged defense of disciplines, which we've seen, for example, in sociology recently, but this is a defense of disciplines, or of something like disciplines, in the interest of interdisciplinarity. Disciplinary boundaries shield science against outside pressure, help scientists exercise quality control, and generate new problems in an ongoing organic way, freed from some of the pressures from the outside. Threats to autonomy from states and institutions clearly matter, but threats also stem from other adjacent disciplines and from programs of unifying science under the guise of some kind of reductionist program or single umbrella, such as E.O. Wilson's notion of consilience. The fieldness of disciplines protects interdisciplinary moves from being co-opted by these reductionist programs. Fields allow interdisciplinary work to be subjected to evaluative assessments that are grounded in semi-autonomous procedures that have been elaborated carefully and pragmatically over time. So my partial defense of disciplines fully recognizes the ontological arbitrariness of the way that we've chopped up the world into different social science disciplines. That means nothing, but nonetheless, we have to have something like a field. It doesn't have to be called a discipline, though. It could be called a semi-autonomous scientific field, for example. And I would prefer that, especially since the connotations of the word discipline, at least since Foucault, have come to include the idea of external control, which is precisely what we're trying to avoid. Thank you.